Welcome to the 46th Writers Week at UCR. 46 years of incredible literary presence. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. Further, we offer acknowledgement to the Asian, Latino, and African American communities who have also built and tended to this city and its surroundings, oftentimes displaced and disenfranchised, despite their labor and commitment to the area. It is our third year online, and we couldn't be more thrilled than to offer captions and ASL interpreters throughout our sessions. And this year we have some on-campus, in-person events for those close enough to attend. We hope that you attend many events this week and spread the news that we are presenting these 33 writers free of charge to all. Pre-registration for virtual events is required, so spread the links as you spread the news. All of the books are available through UCR, Barnes & Noble, and Cellar Door Books online. Please support our authors by buying their books. And following each reading, please stick around for our live Q&A session. With no further ado, we welcome and greatly appreciate everyone here attending this 46th UCR Writers Week Festival. All of our writers presenting, all of our volunteer panel moderators, ASL presenters, and everyone who tunes into these recordings in the post-festival virtual continuum, and to everyone here attending now, welcome to the 46th UCR Writers Week Festival.
Lost program audio again. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, welcome to UCR Writers Week 2023. We're thrilled to have you join us today. Today, we'll be hearing from Mike Songson on Mike Davis, Susan Straight, and Charmaine Craig. As a heads up, for those of you who are joining us today in person, we have about 4 books left outside. However, they will not be available after the event ends. But if you would like, you can still buy them online. First, we will be hearing from Mike Songson. Mike Songson, also known as Mike the Poet, is a third-generation LA native, a poet, essayist, professor, journalist, historian, and tour guide. His latest book, Letters to My City, was published by LARB Press. His poetry has been featured on public radio stations KCRW, KPCC, and KPFK, and TV programs like Spectrum News. His mission is to uplift the next generation of voices and build bridges across varying segments of society, in particular by mentoring teen writers. Mike teaches at Woodbury University, and he was a student and friend of Mike Davis. Welcome, Mike.
Check. I'm alive in UC Riverside. I'm up in Los Angeles here in the wild, wild west, and as the warm wind hits my face, I walk across State Palm Creek. Here's a joint on Flower Street. Watch fans dancing on the porch on Christmas Eve. I smile widely, and as I move the city, my heart beats swiftly as sirens keep by me. I revel in the sadness, my soul is people take full responsibility. Give me everything, it hurts, it's so beautiful. I got the universal, soulful, multicultural, I'm alive in Los Angeles.
I'm out in Los Angeles with no angles on isosceles, citywide topography essentially across massive landscape. We live in chain link two palatial gates in separate economic states, rising birth rates. Below hilltops in the streetscapes, one can barely even equivocate these fluctuations in they're still evident across blocks, blocks, and blocks, and blocks. Extravagance and adversity unlocked palatial
crosswalks, burrito shops, housekeepers hanging out at bus stops, and the country club is all walled off. City's blowing up like a Molotov, and even when I'm in the shower, I'm hearing the horns honk. I'm alive in Los Angeles. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real honor to be here with you. Mike Davis was my professor in the spring of 1997 at UCLA. And the quarter before I graduated, I took the class with Mike called the Emerging Latino Metropolis. And beyond the constellation of ideas he introduced me to, he really taught me how to be a much more complete human being. I owe so much to Mike Davis, I can't even really begin to tell you all about it. It's so much to say about Mike. But I would say initially I learned social consciousness from Mike. His generosity was incredible. He would have us over at his house, and it's not an exaggeration to say he probably gave me 100 books over the last 25 years. He really taught us about the emphasis of real world experience. Everyone knows, of course, that he was a truck driver and a meat cutter, but what he did right off the bat was he sent us out into the real world. One of the first things our class did was we went down to downtown LA at 7th and Grand, and there was an art installation on the history of garment workers. And my buddy and I got out there and we were painting. Next thing you know, we were assisting with an art installation and a mural. Before I knew it, I was meeting muralists, world famous people, Ava Cockcroft, who did a lot of work with Judy Baca, and we were getting plugged into the city instantly. Shortly after I took Mike Davis's class, my friends and I began hosting poetry events. And 25 years later, I'm still hosting poetry events. A sentiment that Howard Zinn expressed to characterize Eugene Debs really applies to Mike. Fierce in his convictions, but kind and compassionate in his personal relations. I've been teaching for 15 years now myself, and I model my teaching practice after Mike. But first of all, I want to talk about how he introduced me to specific environmental, historical, cultural, and geographical details about Los Angeles and the world. When I was about 19 or 20, I read him for a few years even before I ever studied with him. And Mike's writing was the first place I ever heard terms like ecological niches, fortress architecture, fire ecologies, the garden city, edge cities, microclimates, new urbanism, modernism, noir, postmodernism, and dozens of other terms. All of these terms were things that I read in City of Courts. And those cliff notes had me, I probably read 15, 20 books because of his cliff notes. But prior to studying with Mike, I want to talk a little bit about my childhood. I would always drive around Southern California with my dad and grandfather, and they were geography buffs. I grew up on Thomas guides, and my grandfather telling me, you better know that Sepulveda was the 405 before the 405 existed, and Artesia Boulevard was the real 91, and Imperial Highway was the 105. And my grandfather told me about the wetlands and told me that all along where the 105 freeway was, actually the Beach Boys had grown up, and the drummer from Metallica had grown up, and all kinds of different stories. And so by the time I studied with Mike, I was already a history buff. I was already a geography buff. I also watched the Dodgers and Lakers religiously. And I want to say something that Chick Hearn and Vince Scully did for me in elementary school, what Mike Davis did for me in college. Chick Hearn, of course, everyone knows, is credited with creating terms like slam dunk, air ball, dribble drive, finger roll, no look pass, give and go, ticky-tack foul, throwing up a brick. And like Chick Hearn, Vince Scully also introduced me to terms I'd never heard. When Vince Scully spoke about the Santa Ana winds blowing in over Chavez Ravine as the sun sets over the foothills in the City of Angels, I felt that in the core of my being, even before I even really knew what it meant. And so when I read Mike Davis, his vocabulary articulated things that I didn't even know. I'd grown up, like, for example, everyone growing up in Los Angeles in the 80s remembers driving over the Los Angeles River. And you remember the movie Grease and Terminator, and you remember seeing them drag racing on the LA River. And I have Mike, and then I'm reading how Eden lost its garden. And I'm reading about the Olmsted brothers, and I'm learning about the Garden City, and I'm learning about all of these things. And Mike really had a way of capturing it. And at the same time, as though he was using these incredible vocabulary terms, he was bringing it very much down to earth. And next thing you know, my friends and I are going along the LA River, and so Mike really introduced the city to me on a much deeper level, even though I've lived my entire life in Los Angeles County. So by the time I studied with Mike, and by the time I had already been reading him for several years, it got to the point now where I would also be looking for his new articles, his latest article in the LA Weekly and New Left Review, The Nation. And I remember when his essay came out, The Case for Letting Malibu Burn, it was a cover story for the LA Weekly in 1996. And I'm sure everyone knows that article. It's one of his probably 3 or 4 most famous articles. But I remember getting that off the LA Weekly, and it was a beautiful thing. I'm going to do a little bit of a poem. This was a poem that was based on City of Quartz. Is it the sunshine of the catastrophes, flash floods of the traffic? Something about Los Angeles makes music, makes magic. The muse of Los Angeles makes artists get active. Behold the lore of LA authors, behold. Who's rocking the populace in the postmodern metropolis? LA authors. Starting with Charles Fletcher Lummis, sunshine looms large in literary Los Angeles. From the myth of Ramona, Pueblos, California ranchos, orange groves, and the Arroyo Seco, expatriate artists of the 1890s brought the first sunshine wave of LA authors. And the boosters blew the trumpets on the Golden State's landscape. Sun for 300 days, a cure for old age. Find the fountain of youth in Los Angeles. Hyped up pamphlets let the world know the land of the sunshine, the new Eden. It was manifest destiny. But it wasn't heaven for everybody. Besides the boosters, there was debunkers, socialists, expatriate poets, leftist screenwriters, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Louis Ademic, and Jake Zeitland. And Nathaniel West, he was one of the best. The city in flames in the day of the locust. The underground intelligentsia of artists and authors lived in Echo Park bungalows, and McCarthy, he called the Red Hill, and Sinclair yelled, oh, behold the lore of LA authors, behold. There's a little more after that, but after Mike passed, I started thinking about as knowledgeable as he was never very didactic. He didn't really lecture a whole lot in the class. He always wanted students to tell their story. He asked us about where we were from, about our families, and there are several assignments that Mike Davis gave that I still use with my students to this very day. One of my very favorite assignments that Mike did was called The Layers of Identity. He would have students list their layers of identity. You know, father, son, brother, Dodger fan, you know, burrito lover, da-da-da-da-da-da. And students would list 15, 20, 30 different things. And he was helping students see that they had cultural capital and that their stories mattered. And another great assignment that he had us do, he had us interview each other. And he said, you're a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, and you're going to write about your classmate. And please tell us why your classmate is great. And it was about celebrating one another. And so I still do both of those assignments, and students love those assignments. So Mike really was very empowering. And he knew, as Carl Mannheim wrote, that knowledge has a social origin and social use. His class was a community. As I said, he had us over at his house for dinner in Pasadena. Over the years, I went to many more dinners at his house down in San Diego. As everyone knows, he moved there in about 2002, but he would let us look through his bookshelves, his filing cabinets. He even showed me an outline of an essay of his in progress. This was like 1997, 98, when I'm just starting to be a freelance journalist at the time. It's funny, in 2008, when he started here at UC Riverside, he said, you know, there's a student of mine I need you to meet. His name is Victor Zamora. Anybody here know Victor Zamora by any chance? Well, anyway, I met Victor Zamora at his house, and 15 years later, Victor and I are still very good friends to this day. I also, at the same time, met 2 women that I become great friends with, Sarah Borjas and Vicky Vertiz. Any of you know Sarah or Vicky? Fantastic poets, good friends of mine. We were all studying with Mike. I mean, granted, they studied with Mike 10 years after I did, but Vicky, Sarah, and I, Victor Zamora, we all do poetry events to this day, and we would all initially meet really over through Mike Davis. I have a friend of mine named Brian Cross, who's a filmmaker, AKA B+, and he went to Cal Arts in the early 90s. B+ always talks, he's one of the most widely published hip hop photographers, and he did a book that Mike Davis published called It's Not About a Salary, Rap, Race, and Resistance in Los Angeles on Verso, which is widely considered one of the very first hip hop history books ever. Mike got that book published. But Brian Cross, AKA B+, Mike Davis sent him out into the Santa Clarita Valley and had Brian taking photographs of the last remaining orange groves and farms. Victor Zamora said that Mike had him climbing Mount Robideau on the very first day of class. And so Mike made writing a verb. He made writing a verb. He said, you know what, get up out of the classroom. Your education does not stop in the classroom. Your education is out in the real world. And you want to talk about the organic intellectual, there is was there even a better version of one than Mike in the 20th century? Maybe, you know, Grace and Jimmy Boggs, but Mike and Grace and Jimmy Boggs, Mike really lived it. I love those dinner parties, and there's so much more to say, but let me say a little bit more. Mike always gave me incredible book recommendations. I would email him, and if I was researching something, he'd say, well, you know what, you need to check Liebling, or you need to check Joe McPhee, or I told him I like John Coltrane when I was about 23. He said, you know, have you ever heard his Ascension album? Mike would always, his favorite poet was Lola Ridge, who wrote a great book of poetry called The Ghetto that came out in like 1916. Check it out, Lower East Side, New York City, amazing stuff. And when Mike retired in 2015, it was the Writers' Week, actually. I was there that night. Juan Felipe Herrera and Mike read together, killer reading. That night, Mike let V. Zamora and I raid his bookshelf. We both walked out with about 2-3 boxes full of books. I still have them to this day. And another thing about Mike, he was very loyal. I have great memories of dinners with him and Alessandra in San Diego, but also Mike's two best friends with these guys, Ron Schneck and Levi Kingston. Ron Schneck was a truck driver and ended up eventually teaching at Dorsey High School. And Mike and Ron met in the late 60s, and they stayed close to the very end. And Levi Kingston owned a coffee house called Pogo Swamps in the 60s, and he had been a merchant marine. And so Levi Kingston was actually one of the people that he dedicated Set the Night on Fire to. But the night I met Tom Lutz was the same night I met Levi Kingston in 2011 at KPFK Susie Wiseman's house, and there was a great event. And so Mike was always introducing people and bringing people together, and his warmth, I can't even express how much it has stayed with me. And I model my own teaching practice after Mike, and I try to do with my students what he did with me, what he has done for me. And so one of my favorite quotes from Mike was, will the boundaries between different groups become fault lines of conflict or high voltage generators of an alternative urban culture led by polyethnic vanguards? When I read that in City of Courts, my friends and I had just started throwing art events, and I felt like, hey, he's talking about us. And so he had a way of seeing you and making you feel like you mattered and why your stories mattered. And so I can never say too many kind words about Mike Davis. I'm going to do one more poem, and then I'm going to let you hear from our other great speakers here. But this was a poem that was recently published in Alta magazine, and this is my poem for Mike Davis. In the land of the lost mammoths, with pirates, bats, and dragons, and praise of barbarians, you saw Hollywood's dark shadow. Heading south of no north through the City of Courts, you set the night on fire in Echo Park, a generation after they called it Red Hill. You found your thrills listening to Dorothy Healy at 84th in Vermont. Then you hit Pogo Swamp to listen to Levi Kingston's intergenerational swing and ascension. You drove a Gray Line tour bus while reading Karen McWilliams with Filipino tourists. You annotated the diagram of the silver geriatrics who tried to kill Los Angeles. After attending UCLA, you split fast to Belfast to escape and write about prisoners of the American dream. Reagan's magical mystery tour du jour, the war on drugs, unlocked the hammer and the rock. You called their bluff a year before Rodney was struck. Driving a big rig truck seemed like it could be sustaining, but you found your calling fortress architecture in the LAPD for what they are, sunshine and noir. You were even there the day the sheriffs executed Ruben Salazar inside the Silver Dollar by Laguna Park on Whittier Boulevard. And while the world watched LA turn, you presented the case for letting Malibu burn. You excavated dead cities and late Victorian holocausts. You demonstrated that the antidote to ecology of fear is magical urbanism. Let's not forget the rise of the coronavirus. 15 years before, you saw the monster at our door. From the flames of New York, your voice so sharp, from the flames of New York to Dante's Inferno, your voice so sharp, you asked who would build the ark. In 1997, after I read as much of your work as I could, I took your class, The Emerging Latino Metropolis at UCLA in my final quarter before graduating. You helped reveal layers of identity so that we could remember we. Your footnotes, the rope I used to climb into LA history. I read at least a dozen authors I saw quoted in your prose. You invited us into your home and shared outlines of your essays so that we could write our own someday. Thank you so much. Love you, Mike. Love you up there, dude. Love you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your words and tribute to Mike Davis.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Susan Straight. Susan Straight was born in Riverside and still lives there with her family. She's passionate about home, California, the Santa Ana River, the foothills and the deserts, and has been writing about Southern California and the Inland Empire area for 40 years. From her kitchen window, she can see the hospital where she was born, which her 3 daughters find kind of hilarious and pathetic. Most days, she walks her dog, Angel, beside the Santa Ana River, as she has since childhood. Then, past the classrooms at Riverside City College, where she wrote her first short story at 16, which is also kind of hilarious, but hopeful. She has written about the people of California for her new memoir, In the Country of Women, based on women's stories told for 5 generations to Straight and her daughters in driveways and trucks, at parks and funerals. She's published that memoir, 8 novels, and 2 books for children. Her short stories and essays have been published everywhere from The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, and The Guardian to Alta, The Believer, McSweeney's, Zoetrope, Reader's Digest, Real Simple, and Family Circle. She's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Lannan Prize for Fiction, a California Gold Medal for Fiction, and the Kirsch Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Los Angeles Times Book Prizes. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, it's so nice of you guys to come on a windy day. I got a little choked up when you were reading about Mike. I kind of want to do a little bit of a segue, if that's okay with you, because Mike Davis was like a brother to me too, and we're from the same place. So I want to say I'm wearing this sweater, which was knitted by Patrick Carroll, one of our former graduate students, and it says memory on it. And Mike Davis was from Fontana, and I was born actually not in Riverside, but I'm from Glen Avon, Rubidoux. So if you know the west side, I'm from the west side. And just on the other side of where I'm from, there's a granite mountain that we always call Rattlesnake Mountain. And on the other side is where Mike Davis lived. And so we were obsessed with geology, with geography. And Mike's favorite thing when he would come over, aside from talking about Mount Rubidoux, which I still go up all the time, was we would talk about rocks. And he was obsessed with the idea that the rocks in our place were some of the most durable, hard rocks in America. He would say, you and me, we the same granite. And that meant a lot to me. So I'm a little sad, but it was nice to hear about him. So Mike loved the memory of rocks and the land and people. And I thought maybe for today, I'm reading from Mecca, which came out last year and which comes out next week in paperback. I'm going to read 2 passages that I thought Mike would like. And they're from the beginning of the book. And so I think what you have to know is the 2 characters I'm going to read about. One's based on my friend Louis Lozano, who I've known for 25 years. He always wanted to be a CHP officer, but he said he was Moreno and he was from Corona. And so instead, he just got to ride in the wrong side of the car. I wrote about a guy named Johnny Frias, who is a California Highway Patrolman. And this starts actually with the Santa Ana winds. This takes place along the 91 by the Santa Ana River. The wind started up at 3 a.m., the same way it had for hundreds of years, the same way I used to hear the blowing so hard around our little house in the canyon that the loose windowsills sounded like harmonicas. The old metal weather stripping played like the gods pressed their mouths around the screens in the living room where I used to sleep when I was growing up. After I got off work this morning, the wind took a break, and I was knocked out for a little while, waking up to hear Rose Sotelo's radio next door playing ranchero music. Her canaries worried in their little songs. But now that I was back on shift on the 91, the Harley was pushing hard against the bigger gusts, the Santa Ana's blowing crazier than ever, the way they always did in the afternoon, like they woke up fierce from the nap. Brazilian pepper trees, the ones that grew in every vacant lot or frontage area along the 91 and 55 freeways, had these long branches like ferns or seaweed. And when the wind blew them sideways like skirts, I could see homeless encampments under a lot of the trees. It was a Thursday in October. Santa Ana winds, 94 degrees, fire weather, and people were 3 layers of pissed off. Everyone hated Thursday. Wednesday was hump day, but Thursday was when people drove like they wanted to kill each other. Today, everybody was thinking of Halloween, the women wondering what sexy costume they were. The grown-ups had taken over the holiday. The men were pissed that the Dodgers had lost, even though they were supposed to be the boys of October. And now the 2019 baseball season was over. The kids are already tired of school, tired of practice. And then the wind. Every few minutes, dust and trash flew across the lanes. But the fall winds always made me think of my mother, holding me tight in the old redwood chair my father had tied to the porch railing up in Fuego Canyon, while the Santa Anas blew in the black night when they always started. My first memory was my mother talking to me before dawn. The gusts so strong, it felt like our little house would go rolling down the canyon like a tumbleweed. The horses would be snorting in the barn, and my father down in the orange groves, making sure the trees didn't dry out. My mother would say, "Nothing else is for sure but the wind." While eucalyptus leaves and bark flew past us, we might not get rain, mijo, for a whole year, but we always get the Santanas. My mother loved the wind, but she knew the flames would follow, and it wasn't just that she was watching for fire. She would hold me tight and say, "We're going to look out for smoke, but right now, it's like we're in the ocean, under the seaweed. Look at this, Johnny." I have one other little part that I wanted to read for anybody who might be from Orange County. Sorry about this section. Back in 2002, when I was on my first solo patrols, I worked graveyard. Even the words made me nervous. That summer in Santiago Canyon, I found the body of a young Cambodian girl. She was 20 years old. Her car had hit a deer leaping across the toll road at 3 a.m. She and the deer lay 50 feet apart. The old Volkswagen Bug her surfer friends had restored had flown off the freeway and landed in the arroyo, and she was ejected. I remember I shined the flashlight into her face, and I almost passed out. Her eyes. I put my fingers on her neck. Nothing. I called in the accident, and I sat next to the girl. The deer was making terrible noises from the brush. I knew it had managed to crawl a ways, and I was afraid to shoot it with my service weapon until my sergeant got there. I had just started this job. We were way up in the mountains between Anaheim and Irvine. The sage and brittle bush smelled peppery where the car had crushed them. The blood left her with no sound. She had a necklace made of dimes with holes punched in them, braided with red and gold embroidery thread. My mother had coils of that thread in her sewing box before she died. When I went to notify the girl's father, Samanasom, at the apartment where he lived, next to his donut shop in Santa Ana, he sat down on the 2 cement steps. He put his head down, put his hands inside his black hair like 2 starfish. That's what I remember. He sat like that for what seemed like forever, but really, it was about 1 minute. I know, because that's how I got through every shift. 10 seconds, 30 seconds. 1 minute was forever for humans. Samanasom lifted his head that day, and he said, "She have a necklace you don't let someone take." "Dimes," I said. "I'll make sure you get it." So now, even now, every single day, every single dime I saw, every time I drove past Santiago Canyon on patrol, where people were flying down the toll road, never looking at the deep ravines filled with sage and brittle bush, I thought about that deer leaping up out of the canyon and that girl whose grandmother came from a place where no deer lived, where Samanasom had told me a story about his own grandmother surviving a tiger attack in the jungle, the tiger crouching on a branch above her when she was a young girl walking down the path to get water for her own grandmother. I saw that whole thing every single day, the coins around her throat, every day, every time I drove by a donut shop, in the time it takes our brains to to tell an entire story. 2 seconds. If it's okay, I read. I don't know what our time is. You're supposed to be kicking me if I go over.
I think you still got time.
Okay. I told him not to LA stomp me. If you're from the old days, you know what LA stomp means. He's not allowed to stomp me. He's just allowed to kick me. I want to read you one little other passage that I thought maybe Mike would like, because it's a set right around Route 66 in San Bernardino. So this part, it's about the meteor showers. One is called the Perseids. And this is a boy named Dante. And his father, Grief Embers, is Johnny Fraser's best friend. And Johnny's a CHP patrol officer who rides a Harley. And Grief Embers is from San Bernardino, and he's an animal control services officer. So he drives the truck. And they met playing baseball against each other, Santa Ana High versus San Bernardino High School. So if listening to Kyrie give that lovely introduction, I think my favorite thing in the world that I still get to do is to write about Santa Ana, San Bernardino, Rialto, Colton. I always ask my students where they're from the first day. And I love hearing Bloomington, Menifee, Cudahy, South Central. So this is San Bernardino. Dante's alone at his house because now we're in April 2020, so it's the time of coronavirus. Dante was supposed to keep a quarantine journal, and I'm not going to cuss, even though there's cussing in here. Manny in Montreal had texted him, "F that, a diary is for girls." Dante laughed, but he still tried to write in the extra notebook his mother had brought from Rite Aid when school stopped back in March. He was alone at least 4 hours a day now, mostly at night. His mother had to stay in an RV somebody had donated for the nurses to live near St. Bernardine Hospital because she couldn't come home or she'd bring the virus to him and his father. Dante imagined it coating her. The people coughing and the respirators, she said, pushed clouds of droplets into the air by the beds. There were 5 trailers now parked on a dead-end street. His mother's trailer had a Dodgers flag in the window. He and his father left a bag with clean clothes for her at the curb. His father said the animals had started taking over the earth all around San Bernardino, Rialto, Fontana. Dante's father worked extra shifts, too, trying to catch raccoons that had colonized empty stores, possums that had 12 babies inside somebody's locked-up beauty salon. The other day, a huge male bobcat came up from the Santa Ana River and walked right down Riverside Avenue in Colton into a warehouse where the workers freaked out and called animal control. Dante's dad had shot the bobcat with a tranquilizer gun where it was hiding in a big pile of empty boxes in a corner. Then he took the bobcat up to Lytle Creek and left it there in a canyon, waiting in the county truck until he could see the cat wake up and walk into the brush. His father said it was like a drunk dude trying to maintain his dignity, kind of slant-wise, but still proud. He showed Dante a picture on his phone, and it was the most beautiful animal Dante had ever seen. Long legs and faint spots and soft triangle ears standing straight up, a tuft of black hair at the top. That night, Dante's mom came home. She came home on Sunday nights. After she showered and and she said to his father, "Grief Embers, you caught that? Look at those ears." It's like he put mascara on the edge of the fur to make himself look even prettier. Then his mother cooked a huge pot of rice and beans, like she did on Sundays. She made a whole roasted chicken in the oven to last them while she was gone. She sat at the table and ate with them. She was a little bit like her old self. She got out her coupon box and took out the expired ones, and then she looked at his father and said, "You know what? I can see that bobcat walking straight down Route 66. Can't you?" His father looked surprised because his mother had been crying for an hour before dinner in their bedroom. His father said, "I could see him walking right past the Wigwam Motel." It was one of the first songs she had ever taught Dante because she sang all the time. It was something she made his father sing when Dante was little. Get your kicks on Route 66, Flagstaff, Arizona. Don't forget Winona, Kingman, Barstow, San Bernardino. He looked at her swollen eyes. She was in the ICU all night. She couldn't do anything. He couldn't do anything. There was no baseball, no stupid school dance, no little league, no nothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for sharing and also for your tribute to Mike Davis. Next, I'd like to introduce Charmaine Craig. Charmaine Craig is the author of the novels My Nemesis, just published by Grove Press, Miss Burma, longlisted for the 2017 National Book Award for Fiction and the 2018 Women's Prize for Fiction, and The Good Men, a national bestseller. Her writing has been published in 12 languages, appeared in venues including New York Times Magazine, Narrative Magazine, Afar Magazine, and Dissent. Formerly an actor in film and television, she studied literature at Harvard College, received her MFA from the University of California at Irvine, and serves as a faculty member in the Department of Creative Writing at UC Riverside. She lives in Los Angeles. Welcome, Charmaine.
Thank you, Kyrie, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in and come here, and to everyone who's organized this wonderful week. And also thanks to both of you for your words about Mike, who I feel so fortunate to have known and been dazzled by and to learn from. I wish that I had chosen to read something based in Los Angeles, because my book, my forthcoming, well, actually it just came out, book, My Nemesis, takes place really half on the East Coast and half on the West Coast in, I think, a community of Los Angeles that Mike probably would have had a lot to say about. But anyway, I'm going to be reading instead one scene that takes place on the East Coast. And let me just tell you a tiny bit about the narrator of this novel. Her name is Tessa. She is a very successful memoirist. As mentioned, well, she lives on the East Coast with her husband, Milton. It's her second marriage. And when we meet Tessa in the novel, she's been engaged in a really passionate friendship, a correspondence, and then really something that develops into a real friendship with an LA-based philosopher named Charlie. And Charlie actually gets along really well with Tessa's husband, Milton. However, Tessa has a real problem with Charlie's wife, whose name is Wah. And I won't go too much into what her problem with Wah is, but she considers Wah sort of broadly an affront to her feminism, because Tessa has really staked her career as a memoirist on her certitude, really, about what constitutes being a strong woman. She's written a lot about her first marriage, her divorce, and the last thing I'll mention is the essay that she wrote and the book that she wrote on midlife, a book called Midlife, is really what drew Charlie to her and interested him. And one of the things how she describes this book is that it sort of came out of the shocks and shames of parenthood. So I'm going to read you the scene in the book where we first meet her daughter, who's grown. Her name is Eleanor, also known as Nora. And I think that's probably all I need to tell you. Excuse my crooked glasses. I'm too cynical to reserve judgments, as you've no doubt noticed. And you could say that my essay, the one that drew Charlie to her, was written from the perspective of a woman staring down into the abyss of a cynicism that had become too gargantuan to tolerate. There was the wreckage of my first marriage behind me. There was the damage I had caused my daughter, damage whose depths I was only beginning to fathom. There was everywhere the thickening atmosphere of hatred and injustice, in the face of which I could no longer claim to know the purpose of my writing, which broadly took aim at the ways men ensnare women, a preoccupation born of my first marriage, while solipsistically fixating on my own life. This isn't meant to be about my life, at least not apart from Waz. That's Charlie's wife. But after disparaging my tendency toward writerly solipsism, I'll take a moment to tell you about the daughter who led me to the precipice of my vertiginous abyss. That's what she calls her midlife crisis. Eleanor is brilliant, self-possessed, pleasant-looking, preoccupied with justice, sometimes shy, moody, and self-isolating, all in a quiet, diminutive way. I think it's fair to say that we share a certain regard for each other while never having been particularly intimate. I can't remember a time when together we didn't resemble two polite adults rather than mother and child, a strained self-consciousness blooming between us with the divorce when she was 11, and we began to live together half-time, then less than half, then much less. She was 13 when I met Milton, 14 when I yielded to her request that she be left alone whenever I decamped to the farm along with Milton and his college-bound boys. She was 15 when she decamped full-time to her father's place on the Upper West Side. I don't want to get into the business of gender and parenting, but Milton's brand of patience for adolescence had its influence on me. Go ahead and leave her, was his general sentiment. For reasons selfish and feminist, I stifled my nagging counter-argument that Eleanor was just a child, hardly more than a little girl, though I see now that it was also hurt that kept me silent when it came to her retreat. With Milton, I'd had the fantasy of starting a better, healthier period of motherhood. Instead, Eleanor had separated from me with an outsized independence that I told myself would serve her well in life. My actual hour of crisis came when Eleanor was 19 and spending her spring holiday from Sarah Lawrence with her father and his new young family. We often corresponded by email, she and I, which was more natural to our relationship than the messiness of texting. I hadn't been the least put off when I received by email her request that we find time soon to have lunch at our favorite ramen house place near Washington Square. But even before she spotted me emerging from the cotton panels separating the dim restaurant from the rainy street, I felt panic digging its claws into me. Eleanor was seated at a table at the far end of the constricted, mostly vacant interior. Her eyes trained on a menu, her shoulders stiffening under the reproachful tension of her delicate neck. All at once, she turned the menu over so that I knew she sensed my presence and was silently conveying her refusal to reassure me that all was well, that we were well. You see, during her adolescence, in addition to increasingly refusing to stay with me, she had sometimes shut down all lines of communication between us. This was done, I should say, in her nearly silent, avoidant manner, such that it often took me weeks to grasp that her customary remoteness was now complete, and that I had invariably wounded her, though how those wounds were caused, she never proceeded to tell me. I'm aware of having something of a problem with laying blame. When you spend your life in consideration of human relations and your thoughts unavoidably chase down networks of behavioral causality, it's difficult to hold your tongue when your blunders originate in others. Still, even as I wielded my wet umbrella and rushed to the table where Eleanor persisted in her scrutiny of the menu, even as I planted myself down with a breathless Nora and Drew not quite snatched the menu from between her fingers, even then, I assure you, I was already chastising myself for doing harm to her willingness to see me. For an unnerving moment, she stared into my eyes, though there was no meaning in her stare. She seemed to be deliberately stripping meaning from the light waves passing between us. Only then, as I searched her slight features, did I see that she appeared less pale than wan, dazed. It was the same way she had looked as a child when she was coming down with something. "You look well," I lied. I was so afraid of offending her. Even this seemed to be an affront to her, as if it confirmed something tragic in my estimation of her being. She studied my face, her expression vacillating between resolution and hesitancy. She could have been deciding whether to forge ahead with whatever it was she meant to discuss or to give up on me forever. I wasn't pleased when the waitress intruded on all this, and it was almost hurtful, if not surprising, the way Nora lit up with a smile for the woman whom I recall being more interested in the paper on which she scrawled our orders than in returning Nora's courtesy. Yes, Nora was unstintingly polite, and something about her smile now, something about its innocence and generosity, broke my heart open. With it, I remembered the toddler in Prospect Park, eager to join in games at which she was never adequately adept, her already keen intelligence veering left where other children seemed invariably to turn right. "I've missed you," I said when the waitress departed, which was true. Terribly. An indefinable sadness rose to Nora's eyes, and, I imagine, a visible hope in mine. But a moment later, her stiffness returned, and I saw that she was defending herself against another onslaught of disappointment in me. It had been stupid to say I'd missed her when I'd also been negligent about writing, visiting, negligent and circumspect. For a while, 20 or 30 minutes, we managed to find a path through the thickets of our difficulty. The ramen came, as did beers that I'd heedlessly added to our order by waving down our server and calling for 2 Asahis, something I noticed to which Nora didn't object. Then we sought recourse in the spiciness and the foam, stuffing our stunned mouths and dabbing our noses and eyes as Nora said something about her roommate and I said something about a trip Milton and I were planning to take. I wondered if I should invite her, though she would know the thought of including her hadn't previously occurred to me. When we finally relinquished our napkins, it was almost as though we'd arrived on the other side of a good shared cry. But all at once it struck me that Nora wasn't so much sick or upset as chemically altered. Pregnant, I thought. "Whatever's going on, Nora," I said. "Here I am. Let's talk about it." All the light that had risen to her face drained away. "Why do you do that?" she said. And again, she fell into that measured scrutiny, as if she were trying to discover in my expression the answer to a question she dared not speak. "Why do you assume the problem with me is somewhere out there, somewhere far away?" "You're making assumptions. I don't assume. And why do you do that? Word games. Take my words and use them against me." "I have no idea." "But you think you do. You think you're all-knowing. You tell people you write about life. You're tired of make-believe. The make-believe of your first marriage, the make-believe of domestic harmony, the make-believe of liberated women. But you're the make-believe artist. You're the one living in the land of fantasy." Suppose I couldn't sit there listening to her line of attack for another second. But I was also still a concerned mother. "Are you pregnant, Nora?" The question plainly took her aback, and not for its acuity. No, my comprehensive wrongness was evident straight away, something she only emphasized, relished, with a shake of her head and a scoff that verged on hysterics. "I wish," she said now, "I really wish that you were better at reading people and at knowing how you make them feel. I had to read The Divided Wife in English class, The Divided Wife being my second book, the one about our pre-divorce lives. Is that what happened? Can you imagine having to sit there and listen to your peers, your professor talk about published misinterpretations of your own life? Misinterpretations that pretend to be truth with a capital T? You didn't tell the professor we're related?" I think by that point I was shouting, though she'd hardly raised her voice. "Why would I do that when I want people to see the real me? I've only ever meant to represent my side, Nora." Even then, in the interval during which I gasped for breath before my next utterance, I seemed to glimpse the immeasurable cruelty of my honest words. Myself. That's just it, Mom. All you care about is your side. And you don't even know the reality of who you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, Susan, and Charmaine for sharing and reading. Can we give it up one more time for all of our readers? I want to make sure that we all get the chance to talk and for the audience to ask their questions. To get us started, I will ask you to each say how you got started as a writer. Mike, can you start us off?
How I started as a writer. There's a few different stories. One of them is with Mike Davis at UCLA, but one of them, I had an incredible fourth grade teacher, Miss Navarrete, who was an incredible woman. And she took us on a field trip to UCLA when I was in the fourth grade, and she would have us do free writing. And later on, I realized that she must have read Peter Elbow and Julia Cameron and Natalie Goldberg. But Miss Navarrete had us writing up a storm in the fourth grade. We were actually on the television show Two on the Town with her because she had us study Shakespeare in the fourth grade. And but then fast forward a little bit, I graduated from high school in the year of 1992, and the riots were the week before my prom. And so I'm writing all these poems about LA, reading City of Courts, started going to open mics. There's a whole lot of different stories about it, but I was writing record reviews, and LA spoken word poetry scene of the mid 90s was a major part of my life. And I went to a million open mics, and between reading Mike Davis and going to open mics and going to art shows, and we were going to punk rock shows and hip hop shows, and we were doing so many things that I had to write it all down, and just many more stories than that. But really, I would say the early 90s. And the short answer, the early 90s.
Mine is an appalling story. I only ever tell appallingly terrible stories. And I haven't thought about this one for a while. But the other night I was hanging out with somebody. He lives in Ritchie Canyon. He's got longhorn cattle and burros. We went to high school together. And he said, didn't your mom run you over? And that's how you became a writer? And I was like, yeah, that's actually true. My mom ran me over accidentally when I was going into the 7th grade. And then I spent 2 months in traction at Riverside Community Hospital. But during that time, it was fall, and I watched a lot of football. So I became a sports writer first because it seemed like a good thing to do. And I couldn't walk, so it was fun to write about other people who could actually run. And then when I was 15, my girlfriends all got in trouble, bad trouble, which we don't have to say why. But my mom was determined that I would not get arrested at 2 a.m. And so she said I had to go to summer school at RCC. And my mom was never able to graduate from high school. She came here from another country when she was young. And so she had gone back to school at RCC because she wanted to get her AA since she never got a high school diploma. So she was going there and I was going there. And the only classes I could take in the summer were creative writing and health sciences. And health sciences was taught by Dr. Wong, who was a famous Riversider. In health sciences, I learned that I shouldn't eat bacon. And in creative writing class, I wrote my first short story. So I was 15 and I wrote a story about the Herkies Creek area in Idlewild. And at the end of the story, there was a dead body in a waterfall. And then my professor was like, okay. And then my second story took place out in Anza Borrego, where my dad used to take us camping. And there were scorpions and all kinds of, horny toads. And then you got to the end of that, and there was also a dead body. And the professor said, would you like to come to office hours? Is everything okay at home? And I was like, yeah. And the thing was, there were only spy novels and thrillers at my house. That's all my dad's bookcase held. So that's how I became a writer. I first wrote these stories, and it was I always tell my students, some of whom are in the audience, our favorite thing at that time is description, isn't it? We always want to write beautiful lyrical descriptions of things. And I really liked it when I got praised for those since I was so young in the RCC class. And I wanted to do that forever. So that was the answer. Violence.
I think for me, I felt really fortunate in 6th grade to have a teacher who had us do something called a thought journal. And it was, I hadn't appreciated until then, and I don't think I could have articulated this, that I really needed this little space to put big thoughts that there was like no place in life to express. And it felt very vulnerable, but also quite safe because it was this little journal and she didn't grade it. She would read it and then not comment. And for some reason, she then suddenly made me the creative writing representative of 6th grade, which was somehow, she said, because of my thought journal. So that felt I think big thoughts were what was the but there were two other significant mentors. In high school, I had a wonderful English teacher who really introduced me to the modernists and contemporary American poetry and gave me sort of the writer's handshake and told me I was a writer. And just having somebody tell you that is so validating. And then also in college, my freshman year, first semester, writing teacher told me, Charmaine, you can be a writer, but no one's going to roll the red carpet out for you. And I felt like, what a gift, because it was at once saying you can do it, but expect difficulty. And I've been reminded of that this week as my books come out. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'd love to open the floor to questions. All right.
We stunned everybody.
Yeah, right? Well, thank you.
I don't know. No questions? That's a first, right?
Okay, well, I have a question. So, thinking about the writing community, especially the local writing community, and the way that we are paying tribute to Mike Davis today, I'd really love to find a way to appreciate and uplift your voices and the voices of our community while we're still living. If I could just take a moment of appreciation and hear about the ways in which you would like for one another's legacies to be remembered. That makes sense.
You mean like we're gonna die and what are people gonna say about us afterwards?
I'm so sorry. I was thinking about
Legacy always means death
your
to me
story.
because that's what the obituary thing is, which I have to read every day.
I guess I'm really gloomy today.
I'm
did
just
not
saying
mean
my
to
brain
make
went that way too. Do you mean like what are we leaving behind?
Yeah, I guess if we're thinking about the way that we continue the classics, how would you like to appreciate one another's writings?
Susan, I want to hear more about your Santa Ana River because the Santa Ana River is longer than the San Gabriel River and it's longer than the Los Angeles River and it's really underrated. So
it's 100 miles. It's the longest wild river in Southern California. I write about it all the time. I care.
I've been studying the Santa Ana River a little bit lately, and very interesting river.
Well, let's just say how lucky we are to be looking out at you guys. Now I have former students here, who have published. Kate Angers' first book came out this year, and I mean it's a thrill to me to think that I have students who are going to publish. Like that's a big deal. I got some talented writers in the audience. I think for me, this sounds crazy, especially from thinking about being a parent too. But the thing is, people always say, oh, you have 10 books, but you're a mom. Like if you had to pick, I don't think anyone ever asks men that, but they ask me all the time. Okay, if you had to pick between, and I always tell everybody, I've got 3 kids. I have 3 daughters. They're grown. I got a huge family, maybe 400, 500 people, all in SoCal. So family comes first. But I couldn't write without all the stories that I hear from my family and my neighbors and my friends sitting at the bar, sitting on the porch. So I think I feel really lucky to still be in the place that I'm from. And I think that's what Mike Davis was so good at. And that's what I love, giving the perfect book to somebody. I love, talking to somebody about, hey, this is a great story to tell. But yeah, I guess also we write about very specific pieces. So hopefully that, I don't know. You guys know. That's a tough one.
I feel like you do that beautifully, Susan, and you have done so much for this region and this community and this campus.
See, now I sound like I'm gonna die. So that's
why I didn't want to go in.
I don't know why y'all want to go. I gotta go too. I got 2 funerals this week. So I don't know why. I got 7 funerals so far this year. So I'm like,
okay, there you go.
I want to say one real quick thing. My 2 first North Stars were Mike Davis and Horace Tapscott. Horace Tapscott was the founder of the Pan-African People's Orchestra, and I met him around the same time that I met Mike. And Horace Tapscott was one of the greatest pianists in the world, but he didn't really want the fame. He was touring with Lionel Hampton in the early 60s, and he decided to come back to Central Avenue where he grew up, and he started an orchestra that existed for 40 years. And it was 3 generations on the same stage. And Horace Tapscott's whole idea was to use music to educate and uplift people. And they were essentially the musical branch of the Black Panthers. But Horace Tapscott's whole idea was about building community through music. And at the same time that I became aware of Horace Tapscott, and I also met his biographer, Steve Izuardi, who Mike Davis quoted quite a bit in Set the Night on Fire. But I had Mike as a professor. And so Mike and Horace Tapscott taught me. I was coming up in the scene at the time, and there was these MC battles and poetry slams. And I had friends participating in all of that. And I thought it was cool. But Mike and Horace taught me that you could be ambitious and you could be cool. You didn't have to be mean. You didn't have to be mean-spirited. You didn't have to stomp on other people. You could uplift other people. I showed Mike my first LA poems, and he's like, "These are cool. Keep going," you know. And so the community-minded spirit that I learned from Mike Davis and Horace Tapscott, I always say it saved my life. I was 23 years old, and it really helped me. It set me on a path forward. And so I've now published 300 students for the first time. And there's been countless young people that I've put on the mic for the first time at open mics that I've hosted. And everywhere I've taught, I host open mics. And I know a bunch of 60 and 70 and 80-year-old poets. There's a poet named Michael C. Ford who went to UCLA with Jim Morrison of the Doors. And I connected Michael C. Ford and Mike Davis together about 10 years back. And we connected him to John Densmore of the Doors. And so to connect these generations and these different people. And my own daughter is 13, and now she's doing her own little graphic novels and doing these things. My wife is a painter, and my daughter is a better poet than I was when I was in the 8th grade. And so for me, Mike and Horace, these guys taught me that, hey, it's a long game, you know, and if you love the work and you uplift other people, everybody's going to win. But don't be so worried about this and that and who's going to be on this list. And just come together and be together. And that's when I say Mike talked about social consciousness, and Horace Tapscott too. And so that's what I really think a lot about. And Mike Davis will forever mean that to me.
Hi, folks. I've come in the side here to because there's some questions in the from the audience in the chat.
Are we done with the death question?
Really, Dwayne?
I'm hoping.
Dwayne's he's gonna bring it. Come on, Dwayne.
Can people hear me
My
here?
question before the man on the left, you were talking about going to a lot of hip hop shows and backyard shows when you were young, and when I was younger in middle school and high school too, I used to go to a lot, but I never actually thought about writing about them. So I was gonna ask, like, how does it kind of influence your voice today and influence your stories?
Those are the real communities. Those backyard parties were incredible. Like, are you aware of Micah 9 from the Freestyle Fellowship? There was a place called the Good Life Cafe in Lamert Park, and there was a woman named B Hall that ran it, and she didn't let anybody curse on the microphone. And this was at the same time as gangster rap. But what ended up happening was Micah 9 and AC Alone and these musicians called the Freestyle Fellowship, Farside, Jurassic 5, all these groups were coming to rise at the same time. My friends were in a group called Dark Leaf. And because they couldn't curse on the mic, and this was in the height of gangster rap, these artists started coming up with the most incredible metaphors. And if you ever listen to Micah 9, he's like Ella Fitzgerald. He's like Ella Fitzgerald meets Max Roach. I mean, the way that he could scat as a hip hop artist, but he had these incredible metaphors. And at the same time, he's dropping Thich Nhat Hanh and Dalai Lama in his piece. And he's mentioning Alan Watts. And so these artists that I saw were so raw, and they were, they reminded me of, like, hey, this is real, and do this. And they would wear their hearts on their sleeve. And it was, I mean, I saw Rage Against the Machine right before they got famous, Sublime, Green Day, but also at the same time, we were going to Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul and, Souls of Mischief. And that scene was so vibrant and so incredible that, we'd go home and be going to after hours and be writing poems till 5, 6 in the morning. Hey, so write about what you've been doing with your friends.
I had a quick question. As I was sitting here listening to you guys kind of, share your pieces, each of your pieces are so unique in voice, I think. And it made me think about, just like as a writer, I'm trying to kind of hone in on a voice, and it's so clear that you've honed in on a voice, and whether it's this piece or just in general, that is quote unquote your voice. I'm curious what your thoughts are on honing in on a voice or finding your voice, that idea, or your own style or something? How do you come to find that, if that's an easy question at all?
Charmaine, you should start because that was quite the voice. Yeah.
I wish I had a pat answer for that, but I feel like every project is really execution dependent. And for me, the voice of the, if we're going to say that word, the voice of the piece really emerges from the contingencies of my approach. So my first two novels were told, they were sort of big novels, really long, and they were sprawling in terms of time, and they were told in rotating close third. And so, and what does that mean? It's third person, but every chapter has its own focalizer of the point of view. So a different character who's the center of consciousness. So the trick with something like that is, how can you have a sort of aesthetic unity of voice in the whole book, but at the same time sort of impart a slight whiff of the character in the voice with each chapter. And I think that just takes, in a way, finding a voice that is elastic enough to accommodate the. Oh, speaking of voice, maybe that's my cue to stop. Should I?
I like what
No,
you
it's
said
not
about
working.
elastic. That was a good word choice.
Maybe we take a pause until we resolve the echo issue. What do you think?
Let me check mine. All right, well, I'm fine. I'm not? Oh. Yeah.
Oh, Susan.
Is it done now? Is it still echoing?
I think so, but unfortunately, I do think that this is the perfect segue to our conclusion. So I'm so sorry to have cut you off, and thank you all for asking your questions. And I saw that there were a few questions in the chat, and I can only apologize that we didn't get to those. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining us, Mike, Susan, and Charmaine. And I'd like to thank all the audience members here with us today, and for those of you who joined us online. I'd also like to thank our ASL interpreter, Eliza, as well. We hope that you've enjoyed your time with us today. As you know, our goal is to keep Writers Week 100% free, and we couldn't do that without the generosity of our donors with impeccable taste. And if you would also like to continue helping us make these free events year after year, I would love, and we would all love, if you would continue to support us. We appreciate any gift of any size. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you all at the next session. Have a safe drive home. Thank you.
That was good.